I need you to take a deep breath. What's going on? I need you to confirm it for me. Is he not breathing?
What happened today?
My husband passed away unexpectedly last year. So it's March 4th was a 1-year anniversary for us. And he was 39. It completely took us all by shock.
The evidence will prove that Kouri Richins murdered Eric for his money and to get a fresh start at life.
Hi folks, my name is Adrian, and it was on March the 4th, 2022, and inside a family home just outside of Park City in Utah that a truly horrifying nightmare was unfolding. Inside that property, officers found 3 children, a panic-stricken mother, and at the center of it all, a 39-year-old man named Eric Richins who was unresponsive in the bedroom. Paramedics did absolutely everything that they could, but unfortunately, Eric was too far gone to be saved. The news was absolutely devastating for his entire and extended family, and for many of them, it was almost impossible to understand. In the months that followed, his wife Kouri would even publish a children's book about grief and loss in an effort to try to help them come to terms with his death. Which of course sounds beautiful until investigators started to dig deeper into her profile and realized that maybe Kouri wasn't just writing about grief, but she could have actually been the one that created it. And trust me here, but you will really want to see what happened at her sentencing because it truly was unbelievable. Welcome back to Coffee House Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and I post up to 2 times a week here, usually on stories around true crime. So, if that's your kind of thing, please do consider subscribing. Thank you. And I also sell my own coffee, so if you'd like to grab a bag, go to classifiedcoffeeco.com. And so on that note, please grab yourself a coffee and let's get ready for the deep dive today. This is the case of Kouri Richins. Welcome to Utah, folks. It's a state known for its red rock canyons, snow-covered mountains, Mormon roots, expensive ski towns, and, apparently, the rubber chicken industry. It's a beautiful state that is filled with many interesting and quirky people, and has high standards for safety too. Not exactly the kind of state that you'd expect elaborate crime stories to happen in. But unfortunately, here we are. Just outside of Park City sits the small mountain community of Camas, a place that is surrounded by open roads, cozy homes, and, of course, the Wasatch Mountains in the distance. The entire area is peaceful, picturesque, and exactly the kind of place where families move when they want space and safety. And on the surface, Eric and Kouri Richins did seem to have built exactly that kind of lifestyle. However, on the morning of March the 4th, 2022, all of that suddenly changed. It was around 3:20 that morning that Kouri dialed 911, and this is what she had to say.
911, I just the emergency. Okay, tell me exactly what happened. No. Okay, I can't understand you. I need you to take a deep breath. What's going on? I don't know. I was in with my kids. I just came in the bed. And I turned over. It's cold. Cold. Who's cold? My husband. I just light up. He's not breathing? I need you to confirm it for me. Is he not breathing? Okay, can we do CPR? You don't know, I'm gonna tell you how to. Are you willing to do CPR? Yeah. Okay.
To summarize, Kouri told dispatchers that her husband, Eric, was no longer breathing, and apparently, not only was he cold to the touch, but he no longer had a pulse. And when emergency responders arrived, they found him lying in the bedroom. This was the home of a modern family. Eric and Kouri were married, had 3 young sons together, and were otherwise living fairly ordinary lives. Eric worked in masonry and construction, while Kouri was involved in real estate. And together, they looked like the kind of family that you'd hope to one day have. They had a nice house, adorable children, matching outfits, and a kitchen island that definitely cost more than my first car. So, you could say that they had the American dream, but with better countertops added. Now, from the body cam footage that was retrieved on the night that Eric passed away, the house looked disturbingly ordinary. This was a family home that suddenly turned into emergency, and there were no signs of disturbance or struggle. This was just supposed to be another ordinary night for them. Except, tragically, it wasn't. Police officers moved through the property's rooms while paramedics desperately tried to revive Eric. Meanwhile, Kouri could be seen standing nearby in emotional turmoil and allegedly was unable to process what was happening. She told the officers that while Eric was still seemingly okay, she made him a drink that night. My favorite drink, actually, a Moscow Mule. She would also claim that apparently one of her sons was having night terrors that evening, and so she left Eric in the bedroom while she slept next to their son to try and calm him down. And apparently, when she came back to the master bedroom, that is when she found her husband cold to the touch.
Yeah, let me talk to you about this side. Let them do their work in there. How's what happened today? When you said you were fine, what time did you see him when he was alert?
We got a trip together to celebrate something at work tomorrow.
Okay. What time did you guys go to bed? 9:30. Okay. And then what alerted you to him today? Right now.
I just when I sleep like this, wake up and I go back in my own bed. I just crawl over to the side.
And he was laying in bed. What?
So that's not the bed.
Okay.
Now, in the days and weeks after, and while they were trying to make sense of what precisely happened, Eric's death seemed to be painfully simple. That he went to bed one night and passed away without any reason or meaning. And those who were not close to the family simply saw Kouri as someone who was now left to try to pick up the pieces, a grieving woman who now also had to try and be there for her sons without falling apart. Because how do you even explain that to a child? How do you sit all three of them down and say that, unfortunately, your father is never coming home? Of course, this is the kind of grief that a lot of people struggle to put into words. But you could say that Kouri actually did put them into words. Because, and I know we're jumping forward here, trust me, we'll go back to that in just a minute, but a year after Eric's death, she would post a book about grief and loss called Are You With Me? The book was about grief and losing someone that you love, and about still feeling connected to them even after they're gone. Of course, the target audience here was for children, as you can see by the pictures and language. Now, on the surface, this book sounds genuinely heartbreaking. But on the outside, this was about a widowed mother who was trying to convert her pain into something useful. This was a book to help her children deal with the loss that they were now facing, and a way to help her find her own resolution. The book was moving, cathartic, and rather conveniently, very, very marketable. In fact, just after publishing her book, Kouri would even apply to appear on local TV to talk about it. Now, we're going to take a proper look at this interview a little later on in this video, because eventually, it would explode into something far more. Because almost a year prior to that book being released, and about a week after Eric's death, his autopsy results finally came back. And it turns out that he hadn't actually died from natural causes, meaning that this wasn't some random heart attack, and neither was it him just simply going to bed and never waking up. Something else had killed him, and as it would turn out, the secret was hiding right inside his body. It was fentanyl. And I'm not talking about a small amount either, because when they quantified the amount inside his body, they realized that it was over 5 times the lethal dose. Now, as you can imagine, this changes the story quite dramatically. Because all of a sudden, this wasn't just a sad and unavoidable story, but instead was about a man who had been poisoned, and his wife, who was writing children's books about grief, was now looking incredibly suspicious. So, was Kouri really a heartbroken wife who was trying to make sense of her husband's death, or was she doing something much, much colder? And speaking of, who precisely were Eric and Kouri to begin with? Born on May 13th, 1982 in Bountiful, Utah, Eric was the eldest child in a rather close family. Even from a young age, he was both responsible and hardworking, of course making his parents, Jean and Linda, extraordinarily proud. Growing up around the family cattle ranch, he spent long hours in the day helping his father haul hay. And it turns out that he loved those jobs too, because not only did he love to feed the animals, but he would also spend all of his time outdoors. Eric was fiercely loyal, deeply family-oriented, and very protective of the people that he loved. In essence, he was the kind of brother that everyone hopes for. He also loved sports, hunting, archery, traveling, trucks, and simply goofing around. Moving into his adulthood, Eric found himself as a businessman. After serving a 2-year mission in Mexico City, he would go on to build a very successful masonry business. You could say that he had a mind of bricks, blocks, and stone, but a heart of gold. Anyway, it was in the year 2009 that Eric met Kouri Richins at a local Home Depot. Apparently, everyone who knew her saw her as the store's most beautiful employee, somehow. Now, at the time, Kouri was working as a cashier, which meant that Eric, who would often go there for his construction business, would often see her. He was actually interested in Kouri far before he was brave enough to do anything about it. But eventually, he would have the courage to ask a friend to go up and ask for her number on his behalf. Smooth? No. Relatable? Yes, painfully. And it worked. Eric asked her out, the two hit it off, and before long, they were in love. By 2013, Eric and Kouri were married, and from the outside, it did look like the beginning of a busy, ambitious, and very Utah kind of family life. They eventually had kids, property, business plans, and a future that, from the outside, looked full of promise, at least for a while. Now, Kouri did seem like someone who was trying to chase a bigger and brighter version of herself. And after the two got together, her life appeared to turn into something much more ambitious. She would leave her cashier job at Home Depot and then move into real estate, of course, with the ambition of trying to flip houses for profit. She would basically buy properties, renovate them, and then sell them for more money, which of course would be very impressive if she actually did make a profit on them. More on that later. But again, from the outside, she looked like a young mother who was building an impressive business. So, between her and Eric, they had 3 lovely children, 2 growing businesses, a big Utah home, many animals around the property, and the kind of lifestyle that many people quietly aim for. However, as you've likely guessed already, the facade that the Richins family portrayed to those on the outside was very different to what was actually happening behind closed doors. Because, as it turns out, while Eric and Kouri may have looked like a busy, successful and attractive couple that had everything together, there were actually many concerning things happening in the background. Money was actually becoming a huge issue within the family, and I'm not talking about the "we spend too much at Costco" kind, but something much, much deeper than that. As you already know by now, Kouri was involved in real estate and had huge ambitions. But the problem is, those ambitions were not profitable at all. Actually, she had the financial intelligence of a raccoon in a mortgage office. She really had no idea what she was doing, and soon enough, Eric began to notice. Now, over time, he became increasingly worried about her spending, her debts, and the way she made financial decisions. And unfortunately, it gets even worse, because he would soon realize that she had actually been forging a signature on multiple documents, usually for large loans taken out against his very own name, which, I don't need to tell you, is both illegal and extremely damaging towards trust. And unfortunately, this is where their marriage would slowly begin to deteriorate. Kouri had abused Eric's trust in a profound way, and this was financially, morally, and legally damaging to her. You see, Eric had built a successful business of his own through many years of hard work, and by all accounts, he was very protective of what he had created. Not just for himself, but of course for his 3 boys too. He wanted all of his assets, his business, and his children's future to remain secure. And with the stuff that Kouri was trying to pull off, well, she was jeopardizing that for him. It was pretty obvious that Eric was the real breadwinner between the two of them. I mean, just look at their premarital agreement here. Even back in the year 2013, his business and assets were estimated to be worth around $2.7 million. And as for Kouri, well, it was blank. Which is totally fine, by the way, because Eric truly was an outlier, and for many people, money really does not matter. However, for Kouri to come swooping in and then forge loans on his behalf, well, that was some really shady business. And as this trust between them slowly began to break down, Eric would take steps to try to protect himself. He changed parts of his estate planning, moved control of certain assets away from Kouri, and made decisions that quite clearly suggested that he no longer trusted her with the future that he had built, which honestly is a very dark place for a marriage to reach. Eric was essentially scared that Kouri would rip the carpet from beneath his feet, and according to his family, his concerns extended far past just money, because before he died, he even told them that if anything ever happened to him, they should probably take a look at Kouri. So, I guess that brings us to the mansion, the catalyst of this case. Because if there was one physical object that seemed to represent everything going wrong in Kouri's and Eric's marriage, it wasn't a wedding ring, a family photo, or even the Moscow Mule. It was a gigantic unfinished mansion found nearby in Midway. Now, this place was ridiculous. The property sat on nearly 9 acres of land, with buildings totaling more than 20,000 square feet. And if that wasn't enough already, it also had a 3,000 square foot guest house. The planned version of this home included 8 bedrooms, 11.5 bathrooms, a therapy pool, a full-sized pool, an exercise room, a golf simulator, an indoor volleyball court, and even a room for virtual reality. Because apparently, when your finances are already on fire, of course, the logical next step is to buy a half-built palace with more bathrooms than a motorway service station. And it turns out that Kouri wanted it badly, because in her deluded, financially bankrupt mind, this was the big flip. This was the property that could not only clear her debts, but also take her real estate business to the very next level. And apparently, the problem in front of it was Eric. Now, of course, we don't quite know what Eric thought when she proposed the idea, but I'm going to take a guess and believe that he thought that she was losing her marbles. Because, honestly, what an absolutely moronic idea. He instead politely told her that this was probably too expensive for them, which, to be honest with you, is a very valid concern, because this house was a monstrosity. However, initially unknown to Eric, Kouri had actually started the process of buying it. Search warrants would later confirm that the deal was expected to reach around $2 million. However, Eric's family also believed that he was planning to tell Kouri that they would not go ahead with it. And this is where the story becomes extremely uncomfortable, because it turns out that Kouri was set to close on that deal on the very day that Eric died. And it gets even worse, because despite him dying literally that same morning, she would still go ahead and close that deal anyway. In fact, it turns out that on the very same day as the house deal, and not even 24 hours after her husband had passed away, this video was recorded of Kouri celebrating with her family. I mean, honestly, how tone deaf can you be? And this mansion was not just a strange post-death purchase either. It was actually part of a much bigger financial disaster, because according to later court documents, in the months leading up to Eric's death, Kouri's real estate company was buried under extremely high interest debt. Actually, on the day that Eric died, Kouri owed more than $1.8 million in debt. And the day after his death, and when she actually bought that mansion, that number climbed to nearly $5 million. Now, when he was still alive, Eric obviously knew that things were going bad. In fact, it was back in the year 2020, and after he found out that she had been forging his signature for more than $250,000 of credit, that he went to an estate planning lawyer in an effort to try to protect himself and his children by making sure that Kouri would never be able to manage his property after his death. That is not some small marital disagreement or even a we need to communicate better kind of situation, but a man who is quite clearly drawing extremely defensive lines. It was at this point that Eric appointed his sister, Katie, to take over as agent and trustee of his estate, of course deliberately excluding Kouri in the process. And in addition to this, he would also remove Kouri as beneficiary from a $500,000 life insurance policy, which, unfortunately for her, she didn't realize until after he was dead. And there was more to this story too, because it turns out that Eric had a $2 million buy-sell agreement that was tied to his share of the business. And he found out that about 2 months before his death that Kouri had logged into the account and then tried to make herself the sole beneficiary of this money. She actually had no idea, but his life insurance company notified Eric about this change, so he then discreetly changed it to his sister. Another thing that Kouri would not realize until after he was dead. Talk about laughing from the grave. It turns out that Eric was way smarter than she is. So, by early 2022, Kouri's business was drowning, the mansion deal was looming, Eric was refusing to play along, and she desperately needed his money. But the problem is that Eric was alive, and then, suddenly, he wasn't. And then, as we know, the very next day, she tried to close the deal on that mansion. And when investigators looked into Eric's health, they realized that there was another similar situation only a few weeks before he passed away on Valentine's Day. It was only 18 days prior that Kouri bought Eric his favorite sandwich from a local diner, which of course sounds sweet on the surface. But apparently, after taking just one bite of the sandwich, Eric immediately knew that something was wrong, and before he could even take the second, he broke out in hives and could hardly breathe. Now, Eric wasn't actually sure what was going on, but he initially confused it with some sort of allergic reaction. And so, after injecting himself with an EpiPen and then downing a bottle of Benadryl, he got into bed and passed out. And of course, it was only after waking up that he thought maybe something else had happened. In fact, Eric was so suspicious of Kouri at this stage that he even told a friend later that day that he believed that maybe she had tried to poison him. So, it looks like this wasn't just some sort of weird one-off health scare from a sandwich, but actually a failed attempt made by Kouri. And of course, we should probably talk about the fentanyl, because as it turns out, Kouri hadn't just randomly come into contact with it either. In fact, finding out where she got them was relatively easy, because she had been buying those pills from the family housekeeper only a few weeks before Eric had passed away. The timing of it was awful for her, actually, because after the Valentine's Day sandwich incident, she then went back to the housekeeper and asked for something stronger. And then, less than 3 weeks later, Eric was dead from fentanyl. It's safe to say that after investigators found out about each and every one of these details, they were no longer looking at Kouri with questions, but instead were silently preparing to lock her up. Now, according to Kouri, she claimed that she and Eric were celebrating the purchase of this Midway mansion, which, as we know, is a very strange claim to make now that we know that Eric was not actually interested. So, in Kouri's version of events, they were celebrating a house that Eric didn't want, with money they didn't comfortably have, all while their marriage was apparently being held together with duct tape, debt, and bad vibes. She also claimed that she had made Eric a Moscow Mule that evening, which on the surface sounds like a normal, delicious drink. But who's to say that it didn't have one other ingredient in there? Of course, that being fentanyl. After that, she claims that Eric went to bed, that she fell asleep with her sick son in the other room, and then, a few hours later, she came back to find Eric unresponsive. Of course, as we know, Eric's toxicology report proves that he did not simply die in his sleep. Instead, his body contained around 5 times the lethal dose for fentanyl, the very same substance that the housekeeper now admits that Kouri had bought off of her. And so, detectives now finally knew that they had a case to build against Kouri. However, it would take an entire year after his death before they finally felt ready to take her down. By then, she had already created her book about the man that she murdered called Are You With Me, and even had the audacity to describe it as a heartwarming and reassuring book that gently guides children through the difficult experience of losing a loved one, written by a loving mother who personally faced this challenge. Don't worry, by the way, I'm not going to torture you through reading it, but the important thing for you to know here is that Goodreads rates her book at 1.6 out of 5 stars. And it's kind of obvious why. I was able to find an online version of it, and after skimming through it, I realized that, horrific murder aside, Kouri actually does write like a 5-year-old. It's funny because she always seems to act like everybody else around her is stupid, without actually realizing that it's her who is the dumb one. Anyway, Kouri was so proud that she had written a murder book that was comprehensive enough for children to understand it, that she actually reached out to Good Things Utah in desperate hopes that they would interview her. And, unfortunately, they would eventually shut her up by agreeing. It was in April of 2023, about 1 year after her husband passed away, that her interview aired. And this is what she had to say.
My husband passed away unexpectedly last year. So it's March 4th was a 1-year anniversary for us. And he was 39. It completely took us all by shock. And we have 3 little boys, 10, 9, and 6. And, my kids and I kind of wrote this book on the different emotions and grieving processes that we've experienced last year. And, hoping that it can kind of help other kids deal with this and kind of, find happiness some way or another.
By the way, in the space of less than 5.5 minutes, Kouri would say 39 times, which I guess is what happens when your mouth keeps moving, but your brain has already left the interview. Actually, I don't think it ever arrived. It's safe to say that by now, this entire story was starting to become a joke, really. But thankfully, less than 1 month after this interview was aired, Kouri would finally be arrested on suspicion of murder. However, if you thought this story had enough nonsense to it already, we unfortunately aren't finished. So, how precisely do I word this? Well, because Eric's sister Katie was appointed to be in charge of his estate and all of his money in the event of his death, and Kouri wasn't aware of it, Kouri would then go on to make the insane decision to try to sue Katie for all that she was worth. However, after Kouri was arrested, that is when Katie decided to fire back, instead trying to sue Kouri for a total of $13 million. So, by the time this case reached trial, the tension wasn't merely just criminal, but a full-blown war between Kouri and the rest of Eric's family. And that is when officers found a very strange handwritten note. So, while Kouri was in jail and still waiting for her trial to begin, deputies would discover a handwritten note in her cell that would soon become infamously known as the Walk the Dog letter. If the title wasn't suspicious enough already, this letter showed Kouri instructing her mother about what her brother should say to investigators. She actually suggested to her brother that he make up some random story where Eric supposedly ordered fentanyl from Mexico, which of course was simply to try to remove herself from the leading theory that fentanyl entered his system via the Moscow Mule that she had given him. So, in short, she was trying to shape a witness testimony from behind bars, which you may have already realized is deeply illegal. And I think this became one of the broader problems for Kouri, because every time the story seemed like it might settle, there would always be this new additional detail that would just make her look worse. The book made her look strange, the money made her look desperate, the mansion made her look reckless, the fentanyl made her look terrifying, and the letter made her look like she was still trying to control the narrative even from behind bars. So, if I were the jury, I know exactly how I would feel about her.
In this opening statement, I will summarize for you some of the evidence that the state will present over the next few days, perhaps weeks, so that you have a framework to assemble and analyze all of the evidence. The evidence will prove that Kouri Richins murdered Eric for his money and to get a fresh start at life.
By the time Kouri eventually reached her trial, both sides would have very different versions of the same marriage. The prosecution would argue that Kouri was drowning financially, was desperate for the mansion deal, was angry that Eric had cut her out of control, and was convinced that his death would somehow unlock the life that she wanted. But the defense would argue that all of this was circumstantial, that investigators had tunnel vision, and that there was, in fact, no direct video or evidence of Kouri actually putting fentanyl into Eric's drink. They also questioned the credibility of the housekeeper, challenged all of the evidence available, and even suggested that maybe Eric had obtained and taken the fentanyl himself. But in the end, the jury did not buy her story, and in March of 2026, Kouri Richins was officially found guilty of murdering Eric. She was also found guilty of attempted murder connected to the Valentine's Day incident and all other charges, that of course including insurance fraud and forgery. So, naturally, after the verdict was read out, sentencing would happen around 2 months later, which at the time of recording this video was only 2 days ago. It was actually quite surprising for me to realise that all 3 of their children decided to give their own victim impact statements, and I was also surprised at how badly they destroyed Kouri. So, with all 3 of their victim impact statements being read out by their own separate therapists, I can thankfully share these statements with you today. And let me just say, it's a really hard watch.
After my dad died, Kouri would put us in the basement while she was with the neighbor. I felt scared because I thought something really bad was happening again. She would take me to places that smelled really bad. Everything she did made me feel uncomfortable. When someone talks about Kouri, it makes me feel hateful and ashamed. She took away my dad. I want her to go to prison forever. If she got out, I would be so scared, really mad, and I wouldn't want to go with her anywhere. Once she is gone, I will feel happy. And I will feel safer and relaxed and trust people more.
You took away my dad for no reason other than greed, and you only cared about yourself and your stupid boyfriends. You were not caring and watching over me and my brothers. You were not concerned about our health. You made us watch videos of children starving in war areas. You wanted to scare us into eating something that wasn't cooked. You wouldn't let our dog outside, and then the dog would pee inside. You created this problem, then you would smack my dog on the head as hard as you could. You wouldn't let me put my kitten in the garage for safety at night, and we found it eaten by raccoons the next day. You wouldn't let us turn on and use the heater lamp for the chickens and bunnies, and they froze to death. You made me paranoid about sleeping on my dad's side of the bed by saying I might die or get harmed when I was just trying to be close to my dad after you killed him. I don't want you out of jail because I will not feel safe if you are out. You have never said sorry for anything that you have done to me and my brothers. I don't want you to hurt anyone again.
Kouri was always drunk or gone. I was always locked in my room. I can't remember, but I am pretty sure the lock was on the outside. Kouri threatened she would kill my lizard because we didn't want to watch some weird show with her. I was sleeping, and then I went to get a drink of water, then went back to bed. And when I woke up shaking and Bailey called the ambulance and they came and I couldn't talk for a while, I think Kouri had something to do with it because she didn't call the ambulance. She called Bailey and Bailey called the ambulance. At the ER, Kouri resisted to have my blood drawn. And kids who usually have this kind of seizure is when they are a few months old to a year old. I learned later that Kouri bought more fentanyl and had it in the house when this happened. I think this is what happened. She did what she did to my dad in the living room. Ash would bring me food. Kouri would lock me up if I told her she was drunk. This happened pretty much daily. I feel angry that she locked me in my room. I am angry almost all my animals died. I am angry she threatened to kill them. I am angry she killed my dad. Kouri is always drunk. I want the judge to know my dad was a good person and I miss my dad. I miss my dad, but I do not miss how my life used to be. I don't miss Kouri. I will tell you that.
Kouri's selfishness and cruelty did not end with Eric's murder. In the time after Eric's death, Kouri has done nothing but isolate, manipulate, deceive, and do harm to those boys. Almost immediately after Eric died, she cut them off completely from her family, from Eric's family. The isolation was calculated and strategic. Kouri used the boys as bargaining chips with my dad. She repeatedly threatened not to let him see his grandsons unless he could convince me, as Eric's trustee, of his trust to capitulate to her legal demands and give her all the trust assets. While isolating the boys, Kouri provided them with false and harmful information about me and my family.
It's safe to say that the words written by all three sons are by no small measure scathing towards their mother, and it also revealed several new disgusting details about her. I mean, not only was she outed as someone who had very quickly moved on to other men immediately after Eric's death, but it turns out that she was abusive towards her own children and animals too. It's actually really rare that I feel this angry towards a person, because Kouri actually seems unreal. I mean, she was quite literally murdering everything in her path. Now, this next part wasn't actually spoken out aloud in court, but her children are suggesting an alternate version of what actually happened on the night that Eric died. They claim that Kouri never actually slept with any of them that night, but instead she locked herself in the master bedroom with Eric and turned the TV up so loud that nobody could hear him dying. And when they tried to unlock the bedroom door with the broom and key, she actually screamed at them to go away. And the crazy thing is that her oldest son Carter even believes that she also poisoned him too. Seriously, this woman is a sociopath. Now, I'm going to keep the next section short because I don't think she deserves any more time here. But it's kind of obvious what happened to this horrible woman during sentencing. Really, there was no alternative path than to get life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Kouri Richins was convicted unanimously and beyond a reasonable doubt of attempting to murder Eric Richins, her husband, and the father of their 3 children. And then, having failed in her first effort of spending the next 17 days, not changing course, but doubling down, preparing to try again, and ultimately completing the act through the administration of poison. And for what? Money. All for pecuniary gain. Accordingly, Ms. Richins, based on your conviction on count 1, first-degree felony aggravated murder, the court hereby sentences you to life without.
I think one of the horrible things about this case is not just that Eric Richins was tragically murdered, but also that after he died, his death became part of Kouri's public image and brand. In a way, this was a story that was made from a story and an image. It's obvious to me that Eric was a devoted and loving father who was known for helping his friends and family, which, in the end, is precisely the opposite treatment to what he got from his so-called wife. But focusing on him, Eric was someone who loved fully, laughed loudly, worked relentlessly, and lived as though the next adventure was always just around the corner. It is absolutely tragic that he had the foresight to tell friends and family that if something ever happened to him, they should take a good hard look at Kouri, because in the end, and like always, he was right. And unfortunately, what most of us will remember from this horrible story is the mansion, the Moscow Mule, the terrible author, and an interview where, did most of the heavy lifting. You know what? It's actually quite rare to find someone like Kouri, because from the outside, it appears that she genuinely believes that everybody else is stupid, when in reality, she has no idea what she's talking about, executes plans poorly, and honestly, just seems like a total raging narcissist. But the ironic thing here is that, regardless of whatever is actually going on in that deluded head of hers, it no longer matters, because Kouri is behind bars for the rest of her life, and there is nothing she can do about it. And on that note, I'm going to finish this story here today, folks, but thank you so much for making it this far, and I really do appreciate you staying around. Before I go, what do you think about this one? Because to me, this has to be one of the most insane stories that I've covered in a very long time. I genuinely feel heartbroken, not just for Eric's family, but his 3 sons too. And all of this was over something so trivial and stupid. I genuinely can't believe people like Kouri exist. If you found this case interesting, then please do consider subscribing if you haven't yet, as it really does help the channel out. And of course, you can find me over on Spotify, Instagram, and all the other main social media platforms. Anyway, as always, I'll be back again next week for another video. However, until that moment arrives, please do remember to look after yourselves and, of course, each other. Thank you, and goodbye.
You know.